Welcome everybody to our August seminar for the Global Encounters and First Nations Peoples project. I'm coming to you tonight from the unceded lands of Naarm, better known as Melbourne, the lands of the Kulin Nation, the traditional owners who have never ceded their sovereignty. I'm just thrilled today. I've been a fan of Katie Parker's work since I first encountered it a couple of years back, and it's been such a delight to get to know her. We've had the wonderful opportunity of meeting up with her in London just a couple of weeks back, really, I guess a month or so ago. And it was just a real pleasure to find a kindred spirit, not only a lover of maps, but also a lover of Star Wars and Star Trek. So gosh, I was in seven heaven. So Dr. Katherine Parker, Katie, is the research officer at the Barry Lawrence Rudderman Antique Maps, and she also teaches at Queen Mary University of London and the London Rare Book School. She's the co-editor of Imago Mundi, which is, I always get this, I'm very bad at this pronunciation, the Huculate Society. I hope I'm saying it vaguely right. And the book reviews editor for H Maps. She focuses on European production of geographic knowledge about the Pacific in the early modern period, and is a specialist in the history of maps and mapping, Indigenous maps and Indigenous mapping, the history of the book, Pacific history, and history of early modern empires. It's an absolute thrill to have Katie speaking to us today. So take it away, please, Katie. I believe, David, you will hand over. There we go. Terrific.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm just going to get my screen up, and then hopefully it will go to full screen soon. Oops, there, I got excited. Okay, so hopefully everyone is able to see that as a full screen presentation.
I believe so.
Thank you again. Thank you so much. Thank you, Lynette, for that introduction. Thank you to David for his coordination, and also to Leonie Stevens, who's been a great contact throughout this process. It's a delight and an honor to be part of the Global Encounters Network and to be with you all today. I'm excited to be speaking to you about a topic I think that we all consider of historical and contemporary importance, which is the spatial discourse and practices concerning the world's largest ocean. In the case of the European encounter with the South Seas, these practices centrally involved inscription, leaving us with sketches, journals, letters, logs, medals, plates, and as well as printed books, maps, charts, and globes, which we can study. This process largely elided or erased Indigenous perspectives and contributions. Writing and printing is an exclusive and an excluding act. Inscription is not just one method by which historians can access past discussions about the Pacific, however. How to capture the Pacific in lines of latitude and longitude, how to portray the islands and littoral shores, was an important, enduring debate that spanned the early modern period and crossed borders. This debate about geographic representation was used to bolster personal and institutional reputations, as well as to damage them, but it also shaped how European states presented and defended imperial prerogatives. My current book project looks at the production and dissemination of geographic knowledge about the Pacific by European empires in the century prior to the famous voyages of James Cook. By the 1770s, exploration had become dependent on publication for its legitimation in the eyes of international diplomacy and the intellectual community. Despite efforts to the contrary, institutional entities like the British Admiralty could not monopolize Pacific geographic knowledge entirely. The resulting print wars between sailor authors, savants, geographers, and publishers combined with geopolitical events to mark the Pacific as a daunting, watery desert to be endured by Europeans, a far cry from the exotic paradise it would later become to many European readers. While my book project looks most closely at European perceptions of Pacific places and peoples, another project, a collaboratively edited collection, is focusing on Indigenous contributions to mapping in the past and the present. So this volume will focus on three major threads within the wider field of Indigenous maps and mapping. The first is that of critical Indigenous geography and cartography, in which researchers bring an interdisciplinary approach to bear on the role maps can play in Indigenous campaigns and movements of today. Their work is tied to a larger shift in methodology that foregrounds Indigenous peoples and experiences and tailors research towards the benefit of the world's Indigenous communities. For example, Edson Krenak and Carlos Chavez examine how mapping can be used as tools for claiming land rights and representation in Brazil, while Nachi Blue Barnes shows how Native artists in the Pacific Northwest of North America have incorporated map objects in their installations. Candice Fujikane puts critical settler and Kanaka Maoli cartographies in conversation to emphasize future-forward strategies for a more abundant Hawaii. The second strand is digital maps and mapping, which includes groups like Digital Democracy, who work with Indigenous communities around the world in participatory mapping projects. Christine Lukasevich discusses the work of nativeland.ca, whose maps are shown here, a collaborative project that allows users to see on which Indigenous land they are working and living. The final strand focuses on the history of Indigenous maps and mapping. Several scholars will highlight the creation and use of maps by and about Indigenous peoples, many working with or against European overseas empires in Southeast Asian, Latin American, and African contexts. So today's talk is going to fall within this third historical strand, looking at European Indigenous encounters in southern Patagonia and seeing how they were inscribed in maps. It is imperative to point out the importance of such encounters to the creation of maps and to recover the vital role of local peoples in their production. I use the word recover deliberately, as more often than not, the prior presence of Indigenous peoples on ancestral lands and the work of a variety of contributors and of Indigenous agents especially has been erased, elided, or diminished in the process of converting a face-to-face encounter into a manuscript or a printed document that circulates many thousands of miles from the site of encounter. So today's talk is an attempt at this recovery work, as I want to elucidate the ways in which Indigenous presence is recorded on maps and, when possible, to trace the process by which Indigenous peoples are recognized, translated, and transformed. The examples today will come from European sources, and they portray European perceptions and prejudices. They are not direct windows into past Indigenous lives and lifeways, but are murky reflections on European concerns that are coated with a thick patina of imperial power. That said, there are important points where Indigenous peoples have been able to shift the narrative or assert agency and specificity, and these moments are visible in maps as they are in other surviving sources. I will be speaking mainly about visual representations of Indigenous Patagonians, rather than toponomic traces. For more on how place names play into the larger process of Indigenous recognition and elision, I would steer you to the work of Lauren Beck. Finally, it is important to recognize that however they were drawn by Europeans, the Indigenous peoples of Patagonia and Tierra del Fuego have lived and continue to live today on their ancestral lands and elsewhere. By studying past representations of Indigenous peoples, it is important not to reduce them to historical entities, which is to participate in an ongoing and violent rhetoric of firsting and lasting that relegates Indigenous peoples to the past and removes them from discussions of modernity, as Jean O'Brien has shown. Instead, it is hoped that this research can help to underline the vivacity and tenacity of Indigenous peoples and cultures, and to make explicit the processes by which that presence was destabilized by Europeans. The single most important feature in contributing to the stark perception of the South Seas was usually the first to be encountered, the entry into the Pacific via Cape Horn or the Strait of Magellan. While my wider work looks at the French, Spanish, Dutch, and British voyages and their corresponding materials, for reasons of time today, I'm going to limit myself to British experiences of entering the Pacific by looking at 3 examples. The Narbrough expedition of 1669 to 71, which was the first Royal Navy expedition to the South Seas and included considerable encounters with Patagonians. The Anson circumnavigation of 1740 to 44, whose best-selling voyage account and influential commander shaped later voyages, although there were no encounters with Patagonians. And briefly, the experiences of Byron, Wallis, and Carteret in the 1760s, when Britain's imperial gaze fell firmly on the South Seas after the 7 Years' War, and all 3 of which included Patagonian encounters. By the time Cook sailed to observe the transit of Venus, consensus cohered, somewhat reluctantly, around Cape Horn as the preferred route into the Pacific. While the mountainous seas, fierce winds, and Patagonians themselves could challenge an expedition, the Horn could be rounded if attempted in the correct season, a better option than the narrow, winding, and tricky straits that would not be a major focus of the Admiralty until the hydrographic surveys of the early 19th century. Going through the Strait of Magellan or around Cape Horn was a pivotal moment in these voyages, and the early interactions with Patagonians, who already had semiotic baggage in the eyes of Europeans based on their first encounter with Magellan's crew, were often offered with considerable detail in ships' journals and printed accounts. So these are kind of a rich source bank for these encounters. Sarika Davies has written extensively and excellently about Patagonians and Patagonia on maps in the 15th, 16th, and early 17th centuries. Elizabeth Shant posits that it is in the mid-18th century that Patagonia begins to be considered as a coherent region of interest for the British and Spanish empires. A shift that is reflected on maps of the area, as we'll see. Indeed, it is at this time that the term Patagonia began to be used more widely. Previously, only the word Patagonians was in frequent use, with many maps using the land of the Patagonians or the Patagons. In effect, I'm trying to slot this research between the work of these two scholars and build on the contributions of Natalia Gándara Chacana, Maria Jimena Urbina Carrasco, and Rodrigo Moreno Gerilla, among others. Patagonia, as used here, refers to South America roughly south of the latitude of Chiloé, with an emphasis on the shores of the Straits of Magellan and inclusive of Tierra del Fuego. While Patagonians and Fuegians will be used as general terms, there are a variety of indigenous peoples that lived and live in this area, including the Tehuelche, the Mapuche, Huarpe, Puelche, and Pohuenche on the mainland, and the Selknam, Haush, Kawascar, and Yagan peoples in Tierra del Fuego. After all that, let's jump into our first case study. John Narbrough sailed out of the Downs on September 26, 1669, after a summer of planning. The voyage had been the brainchild of one Don Carlos Enriquez, a mercurial character with uncertain origins and variable loyalties. He managed to gain the ear of the English crown and proposed a voyage to colonize the Strait of Magellan and set up a trade in Patagonia. Eager to pursue the possibility of trade, but also intent on maintaining the recently agreed peace with Spain, Charles II and his naval counselors decided instead to approve of a limited voyage to gather information and lay the groundwork for future trade with indigenous peoples in southern South America. The opening of trade routes was the intended goal, with basic geographic information as one of the stated outcomes. What sort of preconceptions about Patagonia and its peoples did Narbrough and his men carry? The story of Patagonians on European maps in the early modern period is still being written, partially by me, but it is tied irrevocably to gigantism, which Sarika Davies has discussed at length. From the first European encounter with the region, that of the Magellan-Elcano expedition, survivors told of a giant man with animal hides as clothes and with a bow and arrows. Derivations of this figure quickly entered European maps, and the man was soon joined by a female giant and often a giant child. Dutch encounters in the beginning of the 17th century spoke of the violence of the local peoples. For example, on this 1602 map of the Straits, included in de Brye's collection of voyages and based on observations by Dutch navigator Sebald de Wert, we see several depictions of Patagonians, both men and women. The legend explains that these were wild people. They are not explicitly called giants on the map, but are shown as large and only partially clothed. Their wildness also denotes their proximity to nature, another way to signal their lack of civility relative to the Dutch sailors. In the text, the local people are referred to as angry giants, thus supposedly justifying their deaths at the hands of the Dutch. As another example, a 1606 map of the Americas by Hondius includes a Fuegian canoe paddled by a man with a woman and a nursing child aboard. The image recalls the discussions of generation suggested in earlier maps, so showing multiple generations of people, but also offers a more detailed facet of Fuegian watercraft, specifically that fire in the middle of the canoe. For contrast, this 1602 map, based on Olivier van Noort's expedition, has no mention of the Patagonians as a regional moniker or as a people. This is not because Noort did not meet any. Indeed, his men shot and killed many Selknam people. The only mention of any indigenous people is the toponym of Patagones Island in the Straits, which is right here. The map is not devoid of imagery, however, as a large and I think slightly sinister penguin is included, tying the area firmly to the passage it contained the opportunities it presents for European ships, and the natural resources it might offer. It is shown as an empty place, a fact undermined by Noort's own account, which accompanied this map and described many Patagonian peoples. Both de Wert and Van Noort dwelled also on the terrible weather of the straits. This reputation for foul winds and devilish currents would come to represent Patagonia just as, if not more than, giants in the following centuries. By 1620, 55 ships had crossed the straits, 23 Spanish, 17 English, and 15 Dutch. This provided enough new encounters with Patagonians to slightly diversify the imagery offered on maps, although Magellan's giants were still an important part of the visual discourse. The role of the weather would only be heightened after the 1615-17 circumnavigation of Willem Schouten and Jacques Lemaire, which bypassed the straits by sailing around Cape Horn. This offered a new route into the Pacific, one also dominated by dangerous weather. Although ships would still traverse the straits, more and more began to prefer the open water route around the Horn, reorienting the European focus on the area more intensely on the maritime and providing for fewer encounters with Fuegians and Patagonians. To return to Narbrough, his voyage did not go to plan. His ship, the Sweepstakes, their escort, the Bachelor Pink, got separated from Narbrough as they approached the entrance to the strait, and the Pink turned back. During his time near and in the strait, Narbrough sought out the local peoples and described them in detail. Although very often his desire to trade was frustrated by the people's hesitancy in approaching or staying near to Narbrough and his men. In a revealing statement in his journal, Narbrough explains, quote, "I used all the judgment I could to trade with them, but all was in want, for they never would come near any of us," end quote. When people were not forthcoming, Narbrough resorted to digging up graves, noting that the skeletons are of, quote, "but an ordinary stature," end quote. He again remarks on their stature when he meets with a group at Port St. Julian, where he says that they are, quote, "of a middling stature," end quote. Narbrough met with indigenous peoples at least 9 times during his voyage, and he records their height at practically every meeting. His preconceptions dominated his face-to-face encounters. He describes them as wearing furs and nothing else, using bows and arrows, and wearing shell jewelry. Highlighting a hierarchical comparative framework that tilts on the axis of civility, he likens the people to beasts, calls their behavior rude, and their situation miserable, and he criticizes them for their lack of clothing. This judgmental language is typical of the period and shows the freighted frameworks through which European observers viewed others. Narbrough did eventually make it to Valdivia, where Don Carlos requested to be put ashore to make contact with Spanish officials. Only after Carlos left did Narbrough discover that he had taken all of his goods with him. The crew never saw the wily Carlos again. Worse, 4 of Narbrough's men were seized by the Spanish, and he was forced to leave without them, lest he upset the peace between England and Spain. A broken mast and bad weather prevented him from extensive surveying on his return trip through the straits, and he made it to England in June of 1671. So how did Narbrough then translate his in-person experiences into map form? Narbrough developed several detailed manuscript charts, such as a draft of Port St. Julian, a draft of Port Desire, and the city of Valdivia. Both the charts of Port St. Julian and Valdivia record indigenous peoples and practices. To focus on the Port St. Julian example, which you see here, Narbrough includes 3 Patagonians up here in the corner, explaining that this is how they appeared on 22nd June, 1670. Interestingly, this was the last that Narbrough saw of indigenous peoples for the entire winter, writing in his journal on that date, quote, "The Indians went into the country and made a fire that night in sight of the ship, and we never saw any other all the time of our abiding in that port," end quote. Narbrough also prepared an impressive chart that was 6 feet in width, one of the most detailed charts of the straits made to that date. And I apologize, I don't have better images. You're not allowed to image these in the British Library collection, so I had to depend on the Hakluyt Society's reproductions in their excellent transcription of the Narbrough Journal. So this is 6 feet in width, and it's one of the most detailed charts that have been made of the straits to this date. The chart notes the places that indigenous peoples were contacted or sighted. For example, in the western part of the straits, Narbrough includes a note that reads, quote, "Many people in this land by the many fires which we saw," end quote. There are indeed smoke plumes illustrated all over the area. The largest feature on the map is a large block of text topped with drawings of 10 adult and 1 child figures. They include both men and women and have details like fur cloaks and capes, buckets, spears, bow, and arrows. To the right are 2 large dome structures labeled as the quote, the native houses, end quote, and accompanied by 2 canoes. This rather remarkable chart offers some of the densest ethnographic detail about Fuegians and Patagonians then recorded, although any reading of it must be conducted critically and from below to disentangle detail from stereotype. Many of the officials and elites to whom Narbrough showed this map were more interested in the information about tidal flows and navigation than in people who did not seem eager to trade or have resources to exploit. When the drawings of the people were noticed, it was not in a positive light. Samuel Pepys, the famed diarist and naval secretary, wrote, quote, Mr. Evelyn, from the rudeness of Sir John Narbrough's drawings extant in the book of voyages I sent him, observes to me the expectations he has of the effects on our mathematical boys' education in Christ's Hospital upon that head, and gives me a very proper hint toward illustrating the usefulness of drawing in a navigator from the scandalous instances of the want of it visible in Sir John Narbrough's original draft he sent me of the Magellan Straits, and the drawings therein of men and beasts done by his own hand. End quote. So Pepys seems bothered by the imprecision in the drawings. They lack scale, are amateurish, and are scattered around the draft. Pepys would most likely have preferred a more exact and less loquacious draft of the region. Seemingly aware of such criticisms and eager to prepare the chart for print, Narbrough created a more formal presentation copy of the Straits in 1673. At nearly half the scale and half the size, so it's only about 3 feet in width, this chart did not need to answer to the same level of detail that Pepys would have expected in the larger map. Narbrough also reduced the number of drawings, with 1 indigenous man and woman, rather than 10. Cartoonish animals, canoes, and huts are still included, but in less obtrusive places. The narrative labels still exist. Indeed, they're actually more numerous and descriptive as to Narbrough's personal exploits and his observations. However, they're also more uniform in style. This second draft would form the basis for the printed version, which you see here in 2 examples. This was published in 1673 by John Thornton, cartographer of the East India Company, and Thornton likely had input on the presentation copies you saw before as well. The illustrations of huts, guanacos, ostriches, and ships have been diminished and sharpened by the engraving method. The overall number of narrative comments has been reduced to those that have to do only with navigation, with only 2 mentions of indigenous peoples. The drawings of the indigenous man and woman have been incorporated into a cartouche containing the title and the scale. Thornton made editorial choices that preserved some of the natural history of the voyage, yet also made the animals and people conform to prevailing cartographic standards. The ornamentalization of the indigenous peoples in the cartouche is in stark contrast to the prominent inclusion of a Roman centurion who's guarding Charles II's coat of arms and list of place names here in the bottom right. The subtle suggestion here is that indigenous peoples could be supplanted. Their own long history of settlement and social and political organization was illegible to the Europeans, as evidenced by Narbrough's text on the larger manuscript map. Instead, here Thornton minimizes indigenous society, making it a placeholder to frame European words and ideas, and juxtaposes it with his English historical and symbolic figures. The next evolution of the map would accompany the first printed account of the Narbrough expedition, which was printed in 1694. So the largest of the visual materials included with the voyage collection was a revised state of Thornton's map. The shoreline of this new map is drawn more exactly, with tighter, darker, thinner lines denoting the craggy coast. The large font of the title is reduced. All drawings are gone in the new version. There are no animals, ships, or most significantly, indigenous peoples. Even the night cartouche protecting the island table is gone, giving way to an unadorned list accompanied by the scale. The overall effect is one of solemn mastery. Such control is undermined, however, by the reappearance of the narrative labels from Narbrough's second manuscript draft. It is probable that the mapmaker studied the manuscript and incorporated details that Thornton had deleted. In the form of these labels, the indigenous presence is marked, but only through Narbrough's voice. The wretchedness of the land is also a major feature of those reintroduced notes. Excerpts include, quote, "the land of desolation all craggy on which is perpetually snow," and, quote, "a rocky, mountainous, desolate land, the top of the mountains covered with snow continually, the air cold," end quote. While the map is engraved in such a way as to draw attention to those areas that Narbrough successfully sounded, if the viewer focuses more broadly, empty spaces are revealed. The inset of Patagonum Regio covers the interior of Patagonia here, but also the inner shores of Western South America, which remained unexplored by Europeans. More empty space is filled by the island table and large tidal cartouche, which is dedicated to Samuel Pepys here, ironically. While direction lines suggest that navigation is possible, even though its execution would have been difficult. A mariner would know this only if they'd seen the earlier manuscript version of the draft, which contained the larger paragraphs on tides and sailing. So this actually isn't useful for navigation. Their omission, however, leaves the impression that such notes are unnecessary, a confidence subtly contradicted if one leans closer and reads the labels, or indeed if one proceeds to read the abridged journal within, which underlines the careful navigation required to successfully maneuver through the passage. The alterations to the several states of Narbrough's Patagonia map, in manuscript and in print, are instructive. They remind readers that maps are mediated objects. The conditions of their production change their presentation and reflect changing political priorities and stylistic preferences. The journey from manuscript to print echoes the broader shift during the early modern period from highly decorative style of portolan charts and wall maps to the more austere nautical chart. Narbrough's drawings were deemed too juvenile and raw for inclusion. They were increasingly corralled and reduced until they were eliminated altogether. This was one method by which Indigenous presence was omitted from the maps, an inadvertent way to silence Indigenous contributions and to empty the land in anticipation of possible English expansion. Over the course of the map's publication, Narbrough's presence is formalized and contained, but he is preserved as the narrator of direct observations. His role as drafter is minimized until, in the 1694 version seen here, it's erased entirely. The map becomes about Narbrough, not by him. Other people's presence is blotted out, reduced from paragraphs and drawings to mere labels that incorporate their actions into Narbrough's personal story. They are effectively silenced in favor of Narbrough, privileging his form of knowledge, maps and ordered journals, brought back for learned scrutiny. Narbrough's printed journal and map together offer a careful, confident overview of the strait, which he successfully traversed twice in quick succession. Others echoed his confidence, suggesting that the strait would become more frequented with time. John and Anson Churchill, in their 1704 voyage collection, wrote that, despite some accidents, quote, "we know that many have passed this strait with little danger, and some with great felicity, though some have had bad weather. Yet there is no doubt but time and good observations may make it more feasible, particularly there being so many good harbors and bays in this strait, where ships may shelter themselves and let the storms blow over," end quote. Time and good observations were not forthcoming, however. The failures of the Narbrough expedition did not encourage the Admiralty to plan another South Seas voyage. Instead, the mantle of Pacific navigation was taken up by privateers and buccaneers, who typically sailed round Cape Horn. It was dangerous, to be sure, but straightforward in terms of sailing directions and materials, and usually faster. It was also the route less likely to encounter other ships, an important consideration for less than legal voyages, and for those trying to undermine the Spanish trade monopoly. This was the route taken by William Dampier, Woodes Rogers, and George Shelvocke. Expediency dictated the choice of entry, or sometimes the exit, to the South Seas. When the Royal Navy did undertake another Pacific voyage, the question as to the best way to enter the ocean was still up for debate. As part of the War of Jenkins' Ear, the Admiralty planned a global assault on Spanish trade, including their Pacific holdings and routes. Commodore George Anson was to lead a squadron of 6 ships to harass Spanish ports and to try to capture a treasure galleon. He did so, as we see here in this painting, even though he lost 5 of his 6 ships and 1,400 of his 1,900 men. He returned to Britain a hero and was appointed to the Admiralty, where he served until his death in 1762, the single most influential member of that body for naval policy, and especially for future Pacific voyages. In his orders, Anson was, quote, to proceed with your ships under your command into the South Seas, either round Cape Horn or through the Straits of Magellan, as you shall judge most proper, and according as the season of the year and winds and weather shall best permit, end quote. Interestingly, Anson offers no explicit justification of his choice of Cape Horn, which was made early on. The first mention of entering the Pacific in his influential voyage account, which was published in 1748, says simply that the delays in manning his squadron, quote, confined his passage round Cape Horn to the most rigorous season of the year, end quote. Anson knew before departing England that a Spanish squadron was already pursuing him. To attempt the strait would be too risky, especially with such a large squadron. His ships could founder, be damaged, or scatter, making them sitting ducks for a Spanish attack. The storms of Cape Horn and the open water evened the playing field, or so Anson hoped. When his ships left Port St. Julian on the east coast of Patagonia, Anson feared falling in with the Spanish. He issued strict orders to stay together so that the squadron could fight the enemy as one on the high seas. Even with the safety of hindsight, the experience of rounding the Horn clearly traumatized Anson and his men, as the text bears out. Anson said of the geography south of St. Catherine's on the eastern coast of Patagonia, quote, we left the last amicable port we proposed to touch at, and were now proceeding to a hostile, or at best a desert and inhospitable coast, end quote. A rare spell of pleasant weather, the finest morning they had since leaving England, gave the sailors hope of an easy passage through the Straits of Le Maire and into the waters near Cape Horn. Quote, thus animated by these delusions, we traversed these memorable straits, ignorant of the dreadful calamities that were then impending, and just ready to break upon us, ignorant that the time drew near when the squadron would be separated, never to unite again, and that this day of our passage was the last cheerful day that the greatest part of us would ever live to enjoy, end quote. Anson continued, quote, the violence of the current, which had set us with so much precipitation to the eastward, together with the force and constancy of the westerly winds, soon taught us to consider the doubling of Cape Horn as an enterprise that might prove too mighty for our efforts, though some amongst us had lately treated the difficulties which former voyages were said to have met with in this undertaking as little better than chimerical, and had supposed them to arise rather from timidity and unskillfulness than from the real embarrassments of the winds and the seas. But we were now severely convinced that these censures were rash and ill-grounded, for the distresses with which we struggled during the 3 succeeding months will not easily be paralleled in relation of any former naval expedition. This will, I doubt not, be readily allowed by those who shall carefully peruse the ensuing narration, end quote. It did take 3 entire months for the squadron to crawl around Cape Horn. There is not sufficient space here to peruse the narration, as Anson suggests, but by the time Anson's centurion limped to Juan Fernandez Island, his 6-ship squadron was down to 3, owing to, quote, the fatal experience suffered in those inhospitable latitudes, end quote. The Severn and the Pearl actually turned back when returned to England. Wager, one of Anson's store ships, wrecked on the western coast of southern Chile, resulting in some of the longest encounters with indigenous Patagonians and the most detailed printed descriptions to date, as several survivors published their misadventures. And I won't be talking about the Wager accounts today, but I can answer questions about them if people would like. So Anson blamed the terrible misfortunes of his squadron on their attempting the passage in March and April. He suggested that ships pass to the east of Stattenland, avoiding the Strait of Le Maire, and sail south to 61°2 southern latitude before turning west. They should attempt to do so no later than January or February, or else face the same deadly conditions with which Anson met. In addition to words, Anson accompanied his advice with several plates of views and a chart. Of the 27 views included in the book, the first 12, nearly half, cluster around Tierra del Fuego. It should be noted that none of these feature indigenous Patagonians, and there is little mention of Patagonians or Fuegians in the text. People were not an enduring part of the landscape to Anson. The views are intended to show how the coasts look as they approach from the sea, but they also augment the feeling of isolation and remoteness described in the text. For example, after first sighting snowy Tierra del Fuego, Anson explains, quote, And though the dreariness of this scene can be imperfectly represented by a drawing, yet the annexed plate contains so exact a delineation of the form of the country that it may greatly assist the reader in framing some idea of this uncouth and rugged coast, end quote. The accompanying plate does indeed show a craggy shoreline, as seen here, with forbidding peaks and no vegetation. The plate that perhaps most effectively combines narrative and navigation is that showing a view of the Straits Le Maire between Tierra del Fuego and Stattenland. The ships proceed south. To the east are the sharp hills of Stattenland. To the west, the larger mountains of Patagonia. However, an intense storm with rain pelting down approaches from the west, the beginning of Anson's trials while rounding Cape Horn. A chart of the southern part of South America shows Tierra del Fuego in its entirety and reveals the confused track of the Centurion as the ship attempts to find its way around the archipelago. The chart stretches from 27 southern latitude to 61 degrees and from 48 to 94 degree western longitude. The continent of South America fills much of the chart, with soundings and ground conditions recorded wherever the squadron could take such observations. The most numerous toponyms are in the Strait of Magellan, based on the charts of Narbrough. The most arresting detail of the chart is Anson's track, which splits into just south of Stattenland. As the squadron struggles west, these two tracks diverge. The label reveals that the more westerly of the routes was where Anson thought his ships were by dead reckoning. In reality, the eastern current, labeled with small arrows, was so strong that the ships were nearly 10 degrees of longitude further east than they calculated. When they did turn north, they nearly ran into Cape Noir and had to return south to get around the continent. The shores of western Tierra del Fuego are marked as, quote, this coast not well known, end quote. So despite the order of the map grid, the precision of the borders, and even of the track itself, the overall impression here is one of uncertainty and peril. Coupled with Anson's gloomy description of the land and the weather of Tierra del Fuego, the most widely circulated description of the region to date portrayed it as empty, unpredictable, daunting, and dreary. Despite the terrors of his passage, Anson continued to recommend Cape Horn as the preferred passage for future British expeditions. He called for a southerly supply depot where ships could prepare for the run. The reason for this is speed and the state of geographic knowledge. The strait offered shelter to be sure, but they were also treacherous. Narbrough had counseled that a ship had to keep the southern shore in sight, or could be foundered on the many obstructions on the northern shore, or taken in by the many other inlets and bays there. Some passed the strait relatively quickly, but others squandered months in the attempt. By contrast, Wood Rogers had passed from the Falklands to Juan Fernandez via Cape Horn in just over a month. Thus, Anson's advice focused on getting the timing of a voyage around Cape Horn correct, rather than falling back on the strait. As for geographic knowledge, Anson appreciated that, although charts had improved thanks to the efforts such as Narbrough's, a more thorough survey was needed. Anson points out that such a survey was part of Narbrough's instructions, but he had failed to achieve that part of his mission. Anson's specific agenda was ultimately thwarted, however, by the very success of his voyage account, which was read across Europe and led the Spanish to object to another Pacific expedition in 1749. They actually quote his own account back at him when he asks permission for this voyage to go. It was not until the 1760s then that the British ventured into the South Seas again. I'm still researching this series of voyages, so this final case study will be brief. The first voyage to sail was commanded by John Byron, who had been with Anson's squadron on the ill-fated Wager. His instructions did not specify how to proceed into the Pacific, and it is unsurprising that Byron chose the strait, where he pursued rumors of Patagonian giants. Byron struggled in the strait, but that didn't deter him. Quote, it is probable that whoever shall read this account of the difficulties and dangers which attended our passage through the Strait of Magellan will conclude that it ought never be attempted again, but that all ships which shall hereafter shall sail a western course from Europe into the South Seas ought to go around Cape Horn. I, however, who have been twice round Cape Horn, am of a different opinion. I think that at a proper season of the year, not only a single vessel, but a large squadron might pass the strait in less than 3 weeks, end quote. He recommended this course of action due to the abundance of provisions available in the strait and suggested passing through in December and January, when weather would be the best. Byron had an extraordinary encounter with a large group of supposedly large Patagonians near the eastern entrance to the strait, which can be seen here. Byron's description of its giant encounter near Cape Fairweather echoes that of Magellan's expeditions 2.5 centuries earlier. Byron wrote, quote, "He was of gigantic stature and seemed to realize the tales of monsters in a human shape. He had the skin of some wild beast thrown over his shoulders, as a Scottish Highlander wears his plaid, and was painted so as to make the most hideous appearance I ever beheld. Round one eye was a large circle of white, a circle of black surrounded the other, and the rest of this face was streaked with different colors of paint. I did not measure him, but if I may judge of his height by the proportion of his stature to my own, it could be not much less than 7 feet." End quote. Byron sent word of this encounter back to England, along with the description of the Falklands, which he had wrongly claimed for England. The latter act would cause a diplomatic scuffle about possession of the archipelago, which was described as, quote, "the key to the whole Pacific Ocean," end quote. The description of the Patagonian peoples, however, sparked a fad in 1766 that enveloped the Royal Society and the Académie des Sciences and inspired a typically biting satire by Horace Walpole. Byron was followed into the Pacific by Samuel Wallis in the same ship, the Dolphin. He was accompanied by Philip Carteret, who had also been around the world with Byron, and who now commanded the Swallow. Both commanders recorded their Patagonian encounters. Inspired by Byron's experience, Wallis brought measuring rods with him, finding the average height of eastern Patagonians to be 5 feet 10 inches to 6 feet tall. The ships attempted the strait in precisely the season suggested by Byron, but they were beset with bad weather and issues with their ships, especially the poor Swallow. The Dolphin stayed in consort with the slow, cumbersome Swallow through the strait, taking a laborious 115 days to clear the passage and illustrating the limitations of that route well, especially for more than one ship sailing in consort. Wallis summarized the experience, quote, "Thus we quitted a dreary and inhospitable region, where we were in almost perpetual danger of shipwreck for nearly 4 months, having entered the strait on the 17th of December and quitted it on the 11th of April, a region where in the midst of summer the weather was cold, gloomy, and tempestuous, where the prospects had more the appearance of chaos than of nature, and where for the most part the valleys were without herbage and the hills without wood." End quote. Wallis provided detailed sailing directions and tables of coordinates, quote, "for the use of future navigators," end quote, although it is clear he hoped that the passage would not be favored by his successors. For Cook's first voyage, it was not. James Cook was explicitly ordered to round Cape Horn, as he had to arrive at Tahiti in good time to set up an observatory to record the transit of Venus. The variable reports of passing the Strait of Magellan rendered it too uncertain to risk. Cook did, however, have some of the first extensive encounters with Fuegians, which were recorded in now iconic images by the voyage artist Alexander Buchan, which you can see here on the right. However, what I want to stress here is the complete separation of the imagery from the cartography. There were no indigenous mentions on the regional map that accompanied the printed account of all 4 voyages, which you can see here. This is cartography triumphant, due in part to larger trends within map aesthetics in this period that reduced the inclusion of decorative elements in all types of maps and charts, but also due to a persistent othering that created a gulf between Europeans and Patagonians, and between Patagonians and the navigation of Patagonia. To conclude, by the mid-18th century then, to the British, Patagonia had become an obstacle to overcome, to get around. Rumors of riches or trade opportunities had proven difficult to realize. Concerted resistance from Mapuche peoples in Chile meant that the Spanish had not expanded southward, while the colonization effort on the Argentinian side of Patagonia would not intensify until later in the 18th century. Whereas there were more encounters between Europeans and Patagonians in the 17th and 18th centuries, the visual discourse still centered around Magellan's first encounter and rumors of giants. The visual While certain details were added, the overall iconography of Patagonians remained remarkably consistent. The possibility of giants was compelling enough that Narbrough, Byron, Wallis, and Carteret were careful to note the size of the inhabitants they encountered. This lingering fascination with the size of Patagonians would spark an intense debate among the scientific societies of Europe in the 1760s and continue to inspire stories and articles, but far fewer maps. Navigation of Patagonia and its peoples were by and large divorced in the minds of Europeans by the time Cook entered the strait. By the time you rounded Cape Horn. The static nature of Patagonian representation on maps points to both their ornamental and comparative roles in the minds of Europeans. Patagonians were considered interesting additions to, not essential parts of, the land in European minds. There was little interest in fleshing out these reductive images because European visitors and readers were not interested in the Patagonians themselves, but rather in what they might reveal about Europeans comparatively and about their lands in terms of resources and survival methods. This point is highlighted by the few details that did trickle into wider European popular consciousness about the region. Besides their giant size, the most frequently repeated details were about Patagonians' use of oil or fat to coat their skin against the freezing weather, about their wearing of fur capes, and about their ingenious incorporation of fire in canoes. Another constant across the depictions is the near nakedness of the indigenous peoples, which references European notions of civility and barbarism, but also climate. Whereas the climactic understanding of human difference was a source of debate by the 18th century, Europeans were constantly amazed that Patagonians and Fuegians could survive in the region at all. By the 18th century, this preoccupation had less to do with fears of degeneration than with anxieties about survival on long-distance voyages. The inclusion of family units and children is also notable in this context. The frequent portrayal of infants and young people seems to be another way to emphasize the aberration of survival in harsh surroundings. Europeans' own experiences of the cold climate were traumatizing, and they projected those experiences onto the indigenous body, marking it as noteworthy for its very hardiness and ability to withstand the challenging landscape. Finally, the example of Narbrough's maps showed how production processes and preferences could consciously and unconsciously result in the reduction and erasure of the presence of indigenous peoples on maps. Patagonia was one of the most peopled areas on a variety of maps in the early modern period. By the early to mid-18th century, there begins to be less imagery due in part to stylistic shifts in mapping preferences. This was more of a general trend in European cartography, and it had the malevolent effect of helping to erase indigenous presence from all maps, not just maps of Patagonia, as they adopted more uniform and standardized symbols and formats. However, this is not to suggest that imagery of Patagonians was diminishing overall. Rather, the imagery shifted off of maps and into illustrations, especially from the 1760s onward. This stylistic change helped to alter perceptions of Patagonia from one characterized primarily by its wild peoples to one characterized by wild and extreme landscapes at the ends of the earth. It is this remote and isolated scenery that continues to draw interest today. The decision to pass through the strait around the Horn was thus an ongoing discussion between British officials and with reference to a growing body of literature written by or on behalf of South Seas navigators. Each printed source tried to leave detailed directions for those that might follow, yet practically every ship found different conditions, features, and resources to those described by predecessors. The act of inscription, which was supposed to provide fixity, was constantly challenged by the geography of southern Patagonia. The region proved extremely unpredictable. The navigability of bays and inlets proved easy for some and impossible for others. Some passed in the Pacific in mere weeks, while others lingered for agonizing months. This left commanders to decide their routes based on their calendar, objectives, and past experiences. They joined an ongoing and wider trans-imperial discussion, which centered on the call for more detailed surveying without the time, ability, and/or instruments to do so. The difficulty in navigating the eastern entrance to the Pacific is a practical one, having to do with extreme weather and a harsh environment for humans to survive. However, the intense experiences of that weather and environment lent the region an aura of myth, which was exacerbated by lingering investigations into giants. The seemingly quixotic nature of southern Patagonia remains one of its biggest draws. Indeed, a chance to visit the mist-shrouded ends of the earth is now a major tourist attraction. For an area that was once only frequented by its indigenous residents who lived there and by a few Europeans who could not wait to pass it by. I'd like to finish with a return to the subject of those indigenous residents. All of these observations underline the pernicious power dynamics at play in maps and mapping. These processes worked against indigenous inhabitants, simplifying their cultures, silencing them, and facilitating exploitation of peoples, lands, and resources. Despite these trends, the indigenous peoples of Patagonia are still active today. They are helping to make their own maps that can better serve the purposes of their communities, as seen in this map, which shows indigenous communities as part of an indigenous-led bilingual education program in Argentina. It is hoped that by better understanding mapping processes, both in the past and the present, we can recover and reintegrate Indigenous presence and contributions into our wider narratives. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm not sure. Oh, there you go. Thank you, David. Thank you. Thank you, Katie. That was absolutely fantastic. Such an interesting set of representations for a group of people. Just astonishing. I mean, I keep thinking there must be some element here. What on earth? How on earth did they think that they were 7 feet tall? But then, you know, they thought Australians, you know, literally had feet for heads. So it's not dissimilar. We're opening up to questions, and I can see there's something in the chat, so that may be a question. That's just a thank you very much. Please put your hand up if or somehow make me aware that you want to ask a question. This is a completely left field question now, Katie.
Of course.
I'm struck by the extraordinary similarities between particularly the Fuegians and the Patagonians and Tasmanians, the way Tasmanian Aboriginal people were depicted. So there's so much similarity there. You know, they don't wear clothing. They don't, you know, they have fat. They put seal fat or any other, some sort of blubber to keep the wind out, the cold out. They wear furs. They don't, you know, they don't have clothing per se. But there's such similarities, and here we are, the two probably furthest places on the planet away from the metropole. And I wonder if there's an element in what you're talking about here that is in fact related to that. You go back in time, in a sense, as you get further away from the centre.
Oh, absolutely. And I think discussions of kind of the noble savage are in play here for sure. More with Polynesians, I think, than is usually lent to Fuegians and probably to Tasmanians as well. They're usually portrayed as a lot less noble and a lot more savage, I guess. But I think with certainly with the Fuegians and the Patagonians, Europeans are just amazed at the audacity of people to live here. Europeans have a terrible time over and over again in southern Patagonia. They don't like it. It is cold. They can't navigate. It's really hard to get around. And so they're just very amazed that anyone could possibly live and even thrive here. And so I feel like there's a conscious attempt to denigrate and downgrade the people living there, because otherwise they just can't, there's cognitive dissonance about how a culture could actually be in these spaces. So I think it has a lot to do with ideas about survival more than anything. And that then has the pernicious effect to then result in being really kind of derogatory about these peoples. Yeah,
it's fascinating. I can see Rosalie has attempted to make a statement or ask a question. I'm not sure. Oh, here we go. And didn't one of the European visitors to Tasmania observe cuts in trees? Indeed, that indicated that they were also giants, because the cuts in the trees for people stepping up to
and that would be a direct because of the latitudes involved. There's kind of a displacement of the Patagonian giants over there, kind of like, oh, this is a far southern island as well, so they must be there. And Europeans will take any indication to think there are giants. So they'll, they look at clubs and bows and arrows. They're like, look, that's a really tall bow and arrow. In reality, it's like a normal bow and arrow. But so there's just kind of constant misunderstanding, or they'll say that's a footprint. It's a huge footprint. That must be a giant footprint, when there's actually, no evidence it is a footprint. So they're just, once the giant thing is suggested by Magellan, it can't be gotten rid of. And it's still something, if you're in the area today, there's a lot of the tourism is now based on giants, and there's mascots about giants and things like that. It's very much like Bigfoot in the Pacific Northwest.
You got to love capitalism.
Yeah, exactly.
Jessie, I can see you've got your hand up. Jessie Burkett-Rees.
Hi, thank you so much, Catherine. It was a fantastic talk. It's something I don't know much about, but wonderful. I was just wondering to what extent you think from your reading of these accounts that they were looking to make realistic observations, or that they were looking for these sort of sensational, wild edges of reality type accounts. Do you think they were seeking that out? That was part of the exotic nature of what they were doing?
No, I think if you ask them, they would say they were only making their, their objective firsthand descriptions, because a lot of them, Narbrough has friends in the Royal Society. They're all highly trained naval officers, so they thought they were being objective and providing really helpful descriptions. So it's interesting as a historian to get to read them from a remove and get to see how there are actually a lot of these preconceptions that are leaking into things. Because Byron has a rough time of it. He's one of the wager survivors, and I didn't talk about the wager very much, but that's an entire other really interesting period. There are 4 voyage accounts that come out of it. There are months-long encounters with Indigenous peoples. Byron himself has months-long encounters with Indigenous peoples. So I think when he comes back 25 years later and decides to go through the Strait, it is to feed into these memories he has, and he kind of wants to rewrite his experience, which was awful. So he decides he's going to have a better experience. So I think he goes in so interested in the giants because he's interested in actually personally kind of covering over this terrible experience he had as a very young midshipman. So there's a lot of things going on under this patina of these men who would identify at the time as natural philosophers, but we would now call kind of as scientific men. So there's clearly a lot of different influences coming in, but if you ask them, they were saying that they were only describing these people with the level of detail that they had been kind of trained to note.
That training's an interesting question, Katie, because we know that certainly in the 19th century, naval officers, 18th century, 19th century, naval officers tend to be quite well trained as for the illustration and drawing. But I'm just wondering, particularly with Narbrough, which is 1669, 1671, what's the training like at that stage in terms of recording?
Samuel Pepys would say there was none.
Yeah.
So I'd love the Samuel Pepys quote where he's just like, Narbrough can't draw. So there wouldn't be, for Narbrough specifically, who at this time was a very decorated captain, there wouldn't have been formal training. He didn't go to a naval academy. The Christchurch Boys School, which is a school for to train naval officers, had just been starting. It was kind of more of an idea at this point. So Narbrough's training, and actually going into the 18th century, all of the training for these officers would have been self-funded. They would have had to buy their own maps, charts, and accounts, and then they would have just studied them before going. So once Narbrough knew he was going to the Straits, he would have gotten his hand on as many accounts as he could. He would have interviewed people that might have been around there and just kind of prepared in that way. He also had many contacts at the Royal Society, and they most likely told him some of the things that they would like him to look out for in a certain extent. And so this is, it's going to be later with the Royal Society, but they have directions for seamen. And so they have lists of things they would like sailors to kind of look out for. So Narbrough would have had all that in his head before he went, but it's very ad hoc and kind of a self-education. As we get into the 18th century, there's still a self-education, but there's been enough kind of generations of this professionalization of the Royal Naval officer at this point that there are kind of an accepted canon of things that they all would have been very familiar with. And so Anson's account actually is full of Narbrough. Narbrough's one of his main sources that he goes back to over and over again, as well as Edmund Halley and Edmund Halley's experiences in the South Atlantic. And so there's this small canon on the South Seas that's kind of growing, and it was the responsibility of naval officers to seek out that canon and to become experts in it. And that's why they're always quoting each other. Byron is very upset when he goes to look for Pepys Island because he was told it was there, and he cites Halley and a bunch of others that said it was there, and then he can't find it. So he just decides it can't be there, which is true, actually.
Okay.
So they're all kind of building on each other. It's an intertextual project.
Thank you. We've got two people with their hands up. So Eva first, Eva Bischoff in Trier.
Let me see if I can turn on the camera here.
Hello.
Thank you for this fantastic talk. I really enjoyed your presentation. Wonderful. I'm stuck with the sinister penguin, though. Penguins, and we know that from Georg Forster's descriptions, don't taste very well. So they don't make sense as a resource. And this is why I'm stuck with this penguin. Penguins and other animals disappear from your maps just as humans do, all kinds of humans or boats or whatever. And I'm still wondering why that is. And this kind of connects to the last question. Is this part of map training? The usage maps are being put to or are expected to fulfill? Is this part of a training process, so to speak, to eliminate extra information, imagery from maps? And what does this tell us about not just map making, but colonial expansion? And you mentioned twice that you think that this is connected to settler imperial expansion. Yet, and I'm arguing here just for the sake of a better understanding, don't get me wrong. You mentioned twice that this is, from your point of view, is connected to that, but British don't settle in South America. So how does this work? Could you please flesh that out a little, maybe?
Sure.
I just want to understand your argument better. I think I agree with you, but I would like to know why.
Yeah. So there is as we get into the mid-18th century, across all cartographic objects, so maps, globes, charts, all of them, we're going to see a decrease in the amount of decorative imagery that is included on a map. So cartouches are going to be simplified to just basically boxes. We're going to lose sea monsters. We're going to lose ships out in the sea. We're going to lose our animals like penguins and seals that used to be kind of bobbing around. And we're going to lose, I would argue most perniciously, when we lose decorative elements, we also lose a lot of instances of indigenous residence and representation. So I think that is an aesthetic trend within all of European map making. So it's not just, it's something that they're trained to do. It's a preference that people, combined with ideas around the ways in which knowledge sharing and knowledge networks are developing. There's a preference for kind of a clearer sort of image. So kind of a just the facts sort of map is just an 18th century preference. So it's a different stylistic preference from the highly decorative maps we see in the 17th century. So that's kind of an overarching aesthetic change that we see. It's a stylistic difference. I argue that that has pernicious effects because we're losing some of the few traces we had of indigenous peoples on these maps. And again, I'm looking at imagery, not at toponomic traces. And so I think that it comes along with this aesthetic chances. We need to be very kind of aware of the ways in which that does actually affect indigenous representation. So that's one part. Maps are clearly tied to possession and power. And in this time period, I think you cannot deny the fact that the mapping of a space, and particularly the mapping of a space as empty, because of course, when we're removing all these decorative elements, it makes space look very, very empty. And all the audience in Australia is very aware of this in the history of Australia being mapped as well, that when you suggest that a place is empty, it means that you can either move into it or you can control it. So the British are never particularly interested in colonizing mainland South America, because that would bring about a huge encounter with the Spanish that they don't want to have. However, they're always interested in colonizing either Pepys Island, and when that island is found to be mythical, the Falklands, which of course they are going to colonize and cause major wars into the 1980s. And so the English are very interested with their powerful navy in having what they call a stepping stone into the Pacific. So that to them is they need a South Atlantic island that will allow them to slingshot then into the Pacific, which they eventually do get within their empire with the South Georgia Islands and the Falkland Islands. So this is part of an imperial project, and the mapping reinforces that, because it's really easy to write on a map that something is a British possession, or it could be, you could write that something's unknown, even though the Spanish know it very well, or indigenous peoples know it very well. So by removing presence or suggesting something's empty, it becomes easier for a colonizer or a settler to move into that space, whether or not they kind of were aware there were people there or not. So I'm not saying it's always a conscious thing. This is what Harley calls both the conscious and the unconscious biases of the map maker to present a space as open or empty or available.
Okay, thank you so much. We've got time for our last question. I Brad Scott, I can see. Welcome, Brad, who has been patiently sitting with his hand up. So we'll make this our last question, and then we'll just sum up.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Good, great. That was really interesting. Thank you very much, Catherine. Just a quick question for me about my background is in history of science and natural history, and I'm particularly interested in this period just in terms of how much the visitors to Patagonia and Tierra del Fuego are picking up on the requests from organizations like the Royal Society to gather information about natural historical world and gather information and knowledge from indigenous peoples in the particularly early period. To what extent are you sensing that is happening? Because you might have noticed from Twitter, I just had I'm working on a plant collection from Patagonia from the 1680s, and it's just I'm not sure how unusual that is.
I think it's hugely unusual. So Narbrough, we know from his network and the social ties that he would have had ties to Royal Society members. We don't have documents stating that they asked him before he went to look for certain things. And based on the kinds of questions that he logs in his journal, he's focused almost explicitly on resources and trade. So he's not interested in the flora and fauna, only so far as if they could turn into something like tobacco or something like that. But since nothing looks to be useful in that way, he's very uninterested in them. He constantly is trying to do sign language to speak with the people, and he's kind of like, well, they don't get my sign language. Something's wrong with them, which one can only imagine, wishes he was more self-introspective and perhaps thought that maybe his sign language was not very clear. But that never crosses his mind at all. So he is very focused on trade and commodity-based things. As we get into the mid-18th century, it's really going to be with the Cook expedition, because they actually spend a large amount of time within Tierra del Fuego and have longer encounters. That's when you're going to start to see, I think, more of that naturalist discourse with, of course, the most famous of naturalists, Joseph Banks, when he is there, and they do a lot of botanizing, as he says, wandering over Tierra del Fuego. But anything before that, I think is actually quite an extraordinary collection. So I would be quite interested to learn more about the collection you're working on, because I'd like to know the reasons it was collected, and if that was for a resource driven kind of interest, or was it a more general one? So I think that's what you have sounds like quite an extraordinary collection.
It does sound absolutely fascinating. We do know that the Dutch collected botanical specimens as well, quite early as well. And I mean, the assumption has always been that Banks, for example, was the first to describe wattle, but in fact, we think there's some, the Dutch are actually doing it earlier. So.
And Dampier's grabbed stuff, so I wouldn't be surprised if the Sebald de Wert and Olivier van Noort, if they brought something back, they were there around 1600. So I wouldn't be surprised if that started a Dutch interest in the same, but the Dutch are not spending a significant amount of time in this period, in the period I'm looking at. There's not many Dutch ships that are going there.
Well, thank you, Katie, so much.
Thank you.
And thank you for some great questions tonight too. That's been fabulous. David is now going to just flick us across to our final slide. So we have 2 more seminars this year. The next one in September is Professor Annie Clark from the University of Sydney, who will be talking about the rock art of Groote Eylandt. And Annie's been working up there on Macassan sites as well as other sites for a number of years now. So really looking forward to that. In October, I'm delighted that we're going to be going to Jakarta for our annual symposium, and there was a call for papers for that. Hopefully anybody who's out there, particularly who could appear in person, might want to drop us a line, and that was we put it on Twitter. It's also on our website and our on our blogs and events section. And the last seminar for the year is going to be Dr. Christy Flannery of the Australian Catholic University, looking at maritime violence and colonial rule in the Spanish Pacific world. That's going to be a hybrid, because we're actually being very bold. We're going to be meeting in person as well as running it as a Zoom meeting for those that can't attend in person. So David is just popped a couple of a link there for our symposium. So please, anybody click on that. Been absolutely delighted tonight, Katie. Really appreciate it. And we appreciate your time. And I'm so glad that the timing is a little bit more kind to us. It's not too horrendously early in London. So thank you very much. And good night, everybody.